I have a cold, so don't come near me. Don't shake my hand. And I may start flagging in my energy while I'm talking. So just giving you that heads up so you know what to expect. But I'm really excited to be here. Oh, you were going to introduce me, weren't you?
I need to grab my clipboard.
Sorry, I totally forgot. I'm going to pretend this didn't happen. And then the nice person is going to come over and actually introduce me.
Pretend what didn't happen.
Exactly. Neuralize all of you. Oh my God, Rory Stewart. I went to this guy's penthouse once. I had no reason to be there, good reason to be there. I met somebody at another party who thought I was interesting and was like, you should come to Rory's house. Which is the kind of stupid thing that happens in New York. And you're always like, oh cool, I've been selected to go hang out with cool people. And then you go and it's miserable. It's always just the worst people in the world. Rory Stewart's this Tory MP, in the UK. And he was a total dick to me, but there were a lot of famous people there, and I guess I could say I was in the same room as them, but it's not really worth it. Okay, you ready?
I'm ready.
Great, let's do it.
Hi, everybody. Thank you for coming. I'm Alex. This is Flyleaf Books. We really appreciate your attendance at this event and your book purchases if you made them. That allows us to keep having events like this, so we really appreciate it. This evening, we have the honor of hearing from Josephine Riesman about her book, Ringmaster, Vince McMahon.
McMahon, yes.
Yeah. And the Unmaking of America. Whew. Okay. Josephine Riesman, Josie, is a Rhode Island-based journalist. Ringmaster is her second book publication after True Believer, The Rise and Fall of Stan Lee. She was on staff at New York Magazine for 7 years. We hope you enjoy the event. Thank you again, and remember, if you haven't gotten a copy of the book, you can grab one up front.
Thank you. Okay, hi everybody. First time I've stood at this podium. How about that? All right. I will fully confess that I did not know I was going to have to be riffing today. Luckily, I was a state champion impromptu speaker in Illinois when I was in high school. So I know how to improvise. But before I do that, I'm going to read you a little section from the beginning of the book. I'm going to read you the intro, which I will warn you, I'm good at, but if you're into audiobooks, my audiobook narrator is a million times better at. She did a terrific job. And I used to babysit her when she was a child. Here we go. Overture. Shoot. We begin at the end of the world. It's April 14th, 2020. The COVID-19 pandemic has killed roughly 30,000 Americans. The unpredictable U.S. president has done nothing of substance to contain the virus and is, per usual, issuing bizarre and contradictory statements via Twitter. The ruling Republican Party is working overtime to attack the idea that public health should even be a function of government. People are cowering in their homes, terrified and angry, eager for distraction, guidance, or both. Only essential businesses are open. All sports seasons have been canceled. All filming of movies and shows has been called off. All of which means the nation is facing an unprecedented world historical threat. There's nothing good on TV. People have been starved for content, says Florida's arch-Republican Governor Ron DeSantis at a news conference that day. I mean, if you think about it, we've never had a period like this in modern American history where you've had such little new content, particularly in the sporting realm. I mean, people are watching, we're watching reruns from the early 2000s. But there's nothing to fear. The governor has a solution. Wrestling will save us. 5 days prior, without announcing anything to the public, DeSantis had amended his state's COVID work restrictions, authorizing in-person work for, quote, employees at a professional sports and media production with a national audience, if such a company meets certain criteria. As it turns out, there's only one athletic entity that fits, according to DeSantis' office: World Wrestling Entertainment, the multi-billion-dollar firm that has dominated pro wrestling for decades. If you only had a passing familiarity with WWE, you might be baffled. How on earth could this spectacle, not quite sports, not quite theater, and not quite palatable for the highbrow snobs of the world, be in the same category as hospitals and groceries? But if you talk to an astute political analyst or any wrestling fan, they'd tell you that it all made perfect sense. This was just Vince McMahon, WWE's then CEO, in action. It helps, for example, to know that Vince's wife, Linda McMahon, was an influential Republican donor and former cabinet member whose super PAC, America First Action, had just announced it would spend $18.5 million on Republican ads in Florida. It also didn't hurt that Vince's longtime friend Donald Trump was the first, and very possibly not the last, member of the WWE Hall of Fame to occupy the Oval Office. Whatever the reasoning, the message was simple. No matter how bad things got, no matter how many people perished, no matter how great the threat to the American experiment, the nation could rest assured of one thing. We would be entertained. So that's how the book starts. And I'm tempted to, tell me if you're allergic to this idea as an audience, but I have to give a presentation in a month at my childhood synagogue, where I became bar mitzvah. They want me to come do a talk there. And I was like, cool, so you can interview me? And the assistant rabbi was like, no, we were hoping you'd give a presentation on the Jewish themes in the book. And I was like, oh boy. Oh no. Because the thing is, I really tried to make this book Jewish. I tried real hard. Vince McMahon is one of the most Gentiles you could possibly, I'm using the kind term, not the slightly slurish Hebrew Yiddish word for Gentiles. But, you know, he really just embodies a lot of whiteness in this country. And I couldn't find, I memean, there were like various Jewish characters who've kind of popped in and out of his life, but I couldn't find, it's not a Jewish story. That said, what I was going to say was, if you're amenable, I'd love to kind of give a riff on what I'm going to do there, which is talking about the thing that I was thinking about throughout writing this book, which is the biblical story of the biblical story of Jacob, of Yaakov. I'll talk about the book, but I'm going to sort of hearken back to Yaakov a few times because I want to practice for this presentation I have to give for the synagogue. So if you'll bear with me. Can I take this out? Can I walk around a little bit? I just sort of like to pace what I'm thinking. So, does anybody here know what Jacob's other name is? Who here has read the Bible?
What?
Come on. Yeah, go ahead.
So I don't know if I'm going to be the only one that you're actually speaking to tonight, but like I'm Jewish-ish.
Yeah.
Bar mitzvah and all.
Cool.
Taught Hebrew school.
Yeah.
Not really, but you know, some nice stories and some good things to think about things. So, you know, trees are a big part of it. It's a nice
Sure.
What's
the issue?
Oh, no, no issue, just that I don't like organized
Religion?
things like that, yeah.
Well, I'm not going to evangelize for anything.
No.
I'm talking about the biblical text,
Yeah.
which is the source code for much of Western civilization. I have no interest in preaching about anything unseen. I'm just talking about...
Is it Israel? Is that...
Yeah, Israel is... I'm not saying that...
No, my Torah portion happened to be...
No kidding. Was the one where he...
About the 12
where he wrestles the angel. Or about the 12 tribes.
Yeah.
Nice. Jacob's blessing at the end?
Yep.
Wow. I just learned how to chant that with my Hebrew class. But anyway, let's bring it back. So basically Jacob goes through a name change. He becomes Israel. And that's where that word comes from. In Hebrew, Israel translates to Yisrael, which one possible translation of it, as was true with a lot of biblical names, we don't know exactly what the derivations were, but might be wrestles with God. Not only that, Yaakov, Jacob, his birth name in Hebrew means God's heel. And the heel, of course, is a reference to the fact that in the story, Jacob and his twin brother Esau are being born, and Jacob grabs his brother's heel because he wants to come out first. And I kept thinking about the story cycle of Jacob while I was writing about Vince, because Vince, like Jacob, was a second son. He did not come out first. He had an older brother named Rod. Like Jacob, he had to win his birthright from his own father, who had abandoned him when he was born, and eventually becomes the patriarch of this massive empire. And I say patriarch very specifically, not just, Lord, because he became a father figure to a lot of these wrestlers. You know, if there were 12 tribes of wrestling, he would be the father of them all at this point. And the thing that I kept coming back to was Vince keeps going through name changes. He was not born, well, he was born Vince McMahon, but throughout his entire youth, no one called him that. Not a single person in his life called him Vince McMahon. Because his father, Vincent James McMahon, was this wrestling promoter in the Northeast who had been stationed in North Carolina briefly during World War II and had met a local woman and had 2 kids. The first one out of wedlock and the second one technically in wedlock, although that marriage may have been illegitimate for other reasons. And then after Vince is born, or shortly before he's born, it's a little unclear exactly when, Vince Sr., Vincent James McMahon, hightails it. And North Carolina becomes the site of Vince, the younger Vince McMahon's youth, despite the fact that his birthright is located all the way up in the Northeast. His father had this giant wrestling empire that spanned, it was called, they called it the New York territory, but he was based in DC and operated in Pennsylvania and a lot of other places that were very populous. And he had a lot of money. But Vince was growing up in North Carolina in poverty with his mother and his stepfather. And so because of the stepfather, who had entered the picture when Vince was very young, Vince was just known as Vinnie Lupton. Lupton was the name of his stepfather, Leo H. Lupton. So Vinnie was just Vinnie Lupton. I talked to somebody, I tracked down a childhood friend of his who said that he and his brother, when they were growing up, didn't even know how to pronounce their birth last name. They pronounced it McMahon because they didn't know any Irish people. And they'd never heard the name before. No one had called them that. So they were Luptons. And that was a bit of a rough place to be in because Leo was kind of itinerant. So although Vince stayed in North Carolina, he never stayed in one place for all that long. He was born in Southern Pines, in a hospital there, raised in Southern Pines in Manly, which is right next door. Then they moved to Weeksville, which is just outside of EC. And then, I'm just giving you the outline. Basically, in case any of you are like from here, I'm hoping I'll name a location and somebody will go, woo, and then we can talk about that. And then, so he's in Moore County, then he went to Weeksville, which is near Elizabeth City, and then he ended up in Craven County, in Havelock and New Bern. And then he went to East Carolina University. He was really deeply embedded here, and this place had a huge influence on him. But it was a miserable childhood in many ways. According to him, he was abused by both his father and his stepfather, and his mother, sexually by his mother. And like I said, they were not well-to-do in any way, and he had this absent father figure, this biological father that he would just wonder about. And eventually, at 12, Vince Sr.'s second wife sort of bullies him into meeting his sons. He had no relationship with Vince or Vince's older brother, Rod. But basically one day, Juanita, the second wife, and Vince's grandmother, Vince Sr.'s mother, Rose, they just show up in North Carolina. They show up in New Bern and say, look, the boys should meet their father. We can arrange this. And they worked something out where Vince got to go on a train and leave North Carolina for the first time in his life and go to New York, where he met his father. My father came up from DC, and they met up in New York, which was kind of the informal capital of the McMahon wrestling empire. And from there on, his life completely changes. He had no interest in wrestling prior to that. There's no evidence of him being a wrestling kid, which is interesting because North Carolina is a huge wrestling state. Like, a tremendous density of important people in wrestling and important things in wrestling have come out of North Carolina. But Vince wasn't watching wrestling growing up. It wasn't until he met his father and then wanted his father to love him that he started engaging with wrestling. And wouldn't you know it, it turns out work was kind of the only place that Vince could try to access his dad or his dad's love, I should say, because he tried doing it at home and it didn't work. As it turns out, Vince Sr. had another family. After he split up with Vince's mom, Victoria, and married Juanita, Juanita had this like niece whose husband left her, and she needed financial assistance and guidance. And so Vince Sr., having abandoned his biological family, decides, I'm going to take over and be the paterfamilias of this family. So he has like kids now, basically. One of them was Vince's age, Carolyn Reardon, who I ended up interviewing, and they were living in the lap of luxury. Vince all of a sudden like would be going on these trips on holidays or in the summers to go to his father's place in first Atlantic City, and then they moved to Rehoboth Beach, Delaware, for their summer home or vacation home. And Vince would go to these gatherings and be completely out of place. Completely out of place. I mean, these were all people who talked with Northeastern accents. These were people who had money. There were all kinds of huge cultural divides between Vince and the family, Vinny, and the family that he was trying to integrate into. And Carolyn basically told me, you know, Vince didn't really integrate with us. It wasn't a good fit. So Vince, desperate for his father's love, decides to turn to the professional realm. And he really throws himself into wrestling. Really threw himself into wrestling. First as a fan, and then when his father pays for him to go to boarding school, the one time in his childhood that he was away from North Carolina was he did 2 years of boarding school in Waynesboro, Virginia. And at the military school, he would throw wrestling shows. Nobody knew this. This had never been reported prior to this book, because Vince has tried to present an image of his childhood as one that is very rough and tumble, full of juvenile delinquency and crime, etc., etc. That's the image he's trying to portray. But I looked up his yearbook and I just cold called people through the white pages and found his roommate and his friends and all of them. And not just for the high school thing, also from throughout his life. And they all gave me the real scoop, which was Vince was kind of a nice guy. Which is interesting, because he's not a nice guy now. That was a stark thing that I had to notice after I'd done X number of interviews about his young life. I was like, nobody's describing this guy as mercurial or a jerk or a weirdo, whereas now anyone who meets him, that's like the default story. Vince is even okay with that. In fact, he encourages it. That's the point. He wants you to think he's a dangerous man, and he is. But he wants you to think that he is just bad to the bone, evil to the core, can do anything he wants, and was always like that. Came out of, sprung forth from the head of Zeus to mix up my mythology. And yet, when I talked to people from North Carolina who knew him, or from Waynesboro at the military academy, the general consensus was, yeah, he was a pretty nice kid. Did all right in school, didn't get in trouble, and the big thing that he did in high school was he started doing wrestling shows at his high school. As a side note, I have been somewhat aghast that the wrestling press has not latched onto that story, which is like kind of amazing. But the wrestling press has kind of, for the most part, ignored this book in general. But because it doesn't fit the narrative. But he would have these pro wrestling shows with costumes and nicknames. He was Ape Man McMahon, by the way. But his friends would come out and they would do these athletic shows that were staged and fun. Vince has never once mentioned this, ever. I dug up a archive.org interview from 1997 with somebody who went to, by coincidence, was there at the same time as this other wrestler, and at the military academy. And the wrestler had mentioned it briefly in one interview in 1997, and that's not even available online anymore. Other than that, nobody knew this shit. Because he wants you to think that he hasn't undergone these changes that we're talking about. When I talk about the name change is always just a stand-in for a larger character shift. And Vince has gone through a lot of those. First he was technically Vince McMahon, but really Vinnie Lupton. Then he became Vinnie McMahon, and then he becomes Vince McMahon, and then ultimately he reaches his final form, which is Mr. McMahon. And if I can fast forward a bit, because this is sort of where the book builds to, Mr. McMahon is his character in the ring. I'm skipping over a lot of stuff, but basically in 1997, he decided to enter the fray of his own programming, where he had previously just been an announcer despite being the owner. The only thing you ever saw of him was that he was the announcer. He threw himself into it and became a character named Mr. McMahon. And Mr. McMahon is like legally distinctive from Vince McMahon. This is very crucial because Vince McMahon is or at least for a long time, was the CEO, now is the executive chairman of a major publicly traded company. And he has to come out there, and what he did was say, at his own behest, no one else was telling him to do it, he was the one who was in control, he would say the most outrageous and awful things you could possibly imagine. He was playing this very evil character, Mr. McMahon. And the thing was, those entities had to be legally distinct, because otherwise you'd see the stock tank every week. Because they'd be like, wow, Vince McMahon said that. They had to create some kind of legal distinction. And I think it's actually, some people make fun of it, but I think it's useful. It was useful for just distinguishing whether something was happening as part of the wrestling fiction or whether it was something that was actually happening to him, because I could refer to Mr. McMahon when talking about the fictional storyline. But more importantly, it gave me a framework for thinking, okay, so who is Mr. McMahon? Everyone just says it's just the alter ego of Vince, right? It's just, this is Vince turned up to 11. But here's the thing. You want to know what Vince says about it? Vince says that the Mr. McMahon character is in no way based on him. Doesn't think that way. And there was a famous rivalry between Vince McMahon, or Mr. McMahon, I should say, and the famous wrestler Stone Cold Steve Austin in the late 90s into the early 2000s. And Vince, when commenting on that rivalry, has repeatedly said, Steve Austin is me in that scenario. Because Vince is, whether he writes something or approves it, everything has to go through him, or at least did for a very, very, very long time. And that was very much included. So he had to, I'm sorry, I lost my train of thought. I'm so high on cold medicine. What was the thing I said right before I went off on that tangent? If I want to rewind 20 seconds. I was talking about, oh my God, it's
Stone Cold Steve Austin.
Right, Stone Cold Steve Austin, right. Vince saw himself as being the inspiration for Steve Austin. Because he had to approve everything. So it's all filtered through his head. And he really genuinely thought, I'm the rebel, I'm the shit kicker, I'm the guy who has pushed every boundary, I'm Stone Cold Steve Austin. Now, weirdly, I take him at his word on this. I think he's right. I think the framework I was describing from before about this whole terrible situation with his father and then throwing himself into trying to get his father to love him through work, I think that's the key to understanding Vince. I know it's a little bit cheap to just say the key to understanding this figure is their parents, but I think more so than most, this is a case where that's the main culprit. Because here's the thing. When he becomes Mr. McMahon, what did he say Mr. McMahon was based on? Well, he said, Mr. McMahon was based on all the rich people I knew growing up who would lord it over me. And I got to thinking after a while, who are these rich people? I've been to these towns. There aren't mansions on the hill. In Southern Pines, you have Pinehurst, but I interviewed a lot of people from Southern Pines. They don't go to Pinehurst, and they didn't when they were kids especially. The only rich people he knew were his father and his father's family. Those were the rich people he knew, and they lorded it over him, and he felt like crap. And I would contend Mr. McMahon is Vince Sr. This was and this is how it gets sort of, again, back to that kind of set of biblical archetypes where, or at least mythic archetypes of kind of the son becoming the father. He ended up deciding at some point that he was going to be as vicious as his father was. Because what he found over the years of working for his father, knowing his father, then becoming an announcer for his father, well, first a venue mediator, then an announcer, and then buying the company from his father, he spent all his time with his dad, and his dad kind of just didn't like him. Here's the thing. Vince will constantly talk about how wonderful and magnanimous his father was, But when he tells stories about his dad, it's always, oh, and let me tell you about the time my dad was mad at me. Let me tell you a story about the time my dad was disappointed in me or told me to get out of this business venture or told me I was ruining the company. He never says anything but pure love for his father. But at the same time, you know, he was, for one thing, abandoned. And then eventually, while he was working with his father, he got to see how his father had gotten ahead. And his father got ahead by being a frickin' wrestling promoter. Now, wrestling promoters are historically some of the least morally inclined people you can possibly imagine in American capitalism. It's the wrestling system, especially as it used to exist before Vince kind of demolished and rebuilt it, has often been compared to that of a mafiosi collective or a cartel. And I think that's accurate. I mean, people didn't go to the cops. You solved problems with your fists. There were codes of honor. The government basically stayed out of their business for the most part. There was no meaningful regulation. They exploited loopholes. And Vince Sr. was among the most devious of all of them. You know, he's spoken of very praisingly by a lot of people, but when you read between the lines, you see what was really there. This was a guy who ruled with an iron fist, even if it was one that was like clad in a velvet glove. You know, it was just, there's a story about Vince's favorite, Little Vinny's favorite wrestler, Dr. Jerry Graham, who was subpoenaed to testify in a Department of Justice investigation about wrestling and about the National Wrestling Alliance, which was the cartel that was kind of running wrestling at the time. And, excuse me, sorry. I apologize, don't come near me. The FBI put a bug in the waiting room for the testimony. And in Vince Sr.'s FBI file, there's a transcript of this. Excuse me, I'm sorry. Yeah. There's a there's a memo where I'm sorry. Maybe I should slow down. Sorry. I didn't expect to be coughing stuff up into my mask. I apologize. Oh, sorry about that. Oh, yeah, thank you. That's great. Thank you. Oh, God. So anyway, the FBI taped him, and there's this memo to J. Edgar Hoover, the desk of the J. Edgar Hoover, saying, hey, boss, we taped Vince and James McMahon, and here's what he said. He said, he's talking to another wrestling promoter. They're chatting in the waiting room. And Vince Sr. starts boasting. He says, I told Dr. Jerry Graham, you know where your bread is buttered. If you do this, that is like testify in the way you didn't want him to testify, you're killing yourself. That is the phrase. And my favorite, the end of it was, self-preservation, fuck it. That was the exact quote from the FBI. Now, Hoover, in his infinite wisdom, didn't do anything. The Department of Justice investigation was over at that point, and I guess they just decided, let sleeping dogs lie. But that's the kind of operator that Vince Sr. was. And Vince learned a lot from his dad. Even if his dad didn't like him, Vince observed his dad very closely. Very closely. And in 83, he basically fooled, like Jacob, who, at a crucial point in the story, pretends that he is his brother Esau, his older brother Esau, covers himself in hair and makes himself seem like Esau because his father, Isaac, is going blind and he wants to get the birthright. And this is basically what happened with Vince. Vince's father, Vincent James McMahon, had been granted the company by his father, who had founded it, Jess McMahon. But there was no deal like that for Vince Jr. Vince Sr. was not going to just give this company to him. He had to buy it, and he had to buy it in a punishing way. He had to pay in balloon payments, installments of 4 quantities over the course of a year, and they're balloon payments insofar as if he missed any of the payments, not only would he not get the company, he would lose all the money he'd already paid. That was still void. But he managed to get the scratch together, and he buys the company. But the quote he has said 1,000,000 times was, I knew that if my father knew what I really wanted to do with the company, he never would have sold it to me. He just says that openly. And he's right. Because what Vince ended up doing was revamping the entire approach, in many ways, that America had to wrestling and destroying the existing system. He just declared war on the National Wrestling Alliance and the American Wrestling Alliance, which was a promotion that was a rival to the NWA, and he destroyed all of them. He buys the company in '83. Within 10 years, there's only like one competitor left. Ted Turner's World Championship Wrestling. Within 20 years, he's bought World Championship Wrestling, and there's no competitors left. You have like tiny little promotions, but as of 2003, he's basically a monopoly in wrestling. And, I wrote this book because I felt like, for a lot of reasons, but one of them was, it kind of boggles the mind how much, similar to Trump, how many times he's won. How many times he has beat the Angel in the wrestling match. That's the famous crux of the Jacob story, is when he gets that name change, it's because abruptly, on this night before the next morning when he's theoretically probably going to get killed by his brother, he is by the riverbank, by the Jabbok, and a man appears. And there's much discussion of whether this is an angel, or it's God, or it's Esau, or whatever. It doesn't really matter. He wrestles somebody, and at the end, the person he wrestles with, he beats him, and the person he's wrestling with says, "You have a new name now, Israel, because you have wrestled with God and didn't remit," or I can't remember exactly the translation, but he gets that new name, wrestles with God, because of a wrestling match. And it's really amazing. Jacob is this very lucky guy. He has like a couple of stretches of bad luck, but he always turns it around and ends up being one of the great patriarchs. And Vince is not unlike that. The federal government came after him and took him to trial for steroid distribution in the 90s. There was a wave of scandal of sexual assault and harassment and pedophilia in the organization and by Vince himself, or among Vince himself. Sorry, I'm kind of fading here. I'm going to sit down. Sorry. I don't mean to make you all nervous for me. I just don't want to. Oh, that's nice. I'm actually going to stop talking right now because I feel like I'm going to pass out, and I want to turn it over to questions. I'm going to breathe a little bit. If any of you have a question, I think now would be a good time. I'm sorry, this is a little unorthodox. I just sort of have to sit down and catch my breath for a moment, and I'm having a little trouble being impromptu with my presentation. Does anybody, at least so far, have any questions? Is there anything that's popped up for anyone? Yes.
So I haven't read the book yet.
That's fine. Ask away.
I would love to hear more about the early promotions in high school.
Yeah, I wish I knew more. I wish there were photos. I interviewed all these people, and they're all pretty old at this point. Few of them could remember a lot of details. 8-Man McMahon was a great detail to get. But most of them didn't recall other than there were a lot of costumes. There was a lot of fun. It was after hours. It was in the school gym. So presumably he had approval from the administration. And I think it was a turning point in his life. He did sports too at that school. He was on the football team and the Greco-Roman wrestling team. But he wasn't very good at either of them. And what people kept telling me was the wrestling that he really liked was his father's brand of wrestling. And the word that everybody used, not just in high school, but throughout his life, the number one, or I should say at least the modal word that kept coming up was showman. I would ask what kind of guy was Vince when you knew him, and people would say, he's a showman. He's Vince. It's what you expect. And the high school friends were very much in that basket. They kept saying, he was a really fun guy to hang out with when he was doing this wrestling stuff. And other than that, he was a nice kid. We liked him. I hope somebody has an 8mm camera footage of that, or somebody took a photo. Nobody I interviewed had any idea if there were photos of it. And they couldn't remember too many details. But enough people told me it happened. And it was not a single source thing that I'm pretty sure it happened. But I I'd love to find out more. I mean, I'm hoping to write a sequel to this book, or maybe like a double-sized expansion of it, because this book ends in 1999. The core narrative does. I'm just going to warn you right now, because I had a very strict word count, and Vince has lived a very eventful life. It was going to be very hard to get his entire life into one book at the word count that I've been contracted for. So I decided to kind of break it up, and hopefully I'll do a part 2 at some point. I don't want to do it until Vince is no longer with us, because then I can complete the story, then I can have an endpoint to it. And that could be a long time from now. His mother, Victoria, died at 101 last year. So he's 77. He could keep going for a while. But I do hope that this sparks some degree of interest in Vince McMahon's studies, and that people go digging and maybe find stuff. I hope this is the beginning rather than the ending of sort of the hunt for information about Vince's high school years. Yes, question.
I mean, I might as well, ask probably the standard.
Ask a standard, and that'll be easy for me then.
Yeah, well, I mean, if you can just kind of talk about your own kind of personal history with professional
Sure,
wrestling.
yeah. Sure. I was watching wrestling for about 3 years when I was in high school, junior high and high school. That was the peak of my fandom. I saw wrestling a couple of times when I was a very young kid. I dedicate the book to my mother because there was this time when I was about 6, and I was just flipping through channels and saw Hulk Hogan on WWF, as the company was known back then. And I didn't get into wrestling, but the image of Hulk Hogan ripping his shirt in half was really compelling to me. And I went up to my mom and I said, I want to have a tearaway shirt like Hogan does. Because I didn't think anybody could be strong enough to rip a t-shirt apart with their bare hands. Of course, that was what he was doing. But she, probably told me, well, I don't think there's any such thing. I probably cried. All I remember was, eventually, she took one of my little t-shirts, kind of slit down the middle, and then tied shoestrings on either side so you could sort of pull it open a little bit and then tighten it and get it back together. But that was kind of a one-off. That was not my general approach to life, being a wrestling fan. I just saw it a few times. And then for a while, I was actually militantly against wrestling because all of my bullies loved it. There's a particular kind of humiliation and rage that comes when you're being gay bashed by somebody wearing a t-shirt that just says "suck it" on it, as was the slogan of one of the wrestling stables back then. But that was the case. You had all these people who were deeply uncomfortable with their own sexuality, masculinity, whatever, and that would manifest both in abuse of other people, but also in these weird displays that wrestling allowed you to have, such as the Degeneration X slogan, which was, I've got two words for you, suck it. And you would gesture at your crotch. Now, anyone here who's a millennial, you'll remember, everyone did that. You didn't even if you didn't watch wrestling, it was just part of the culture. As of the late 90s, you could not avoid wrestling if you were a young person. Maybe if you were an old person, but you'd have to run pretty far because it was on all the time, whether it was in the wrestling shows or wrestlers appearing other places. But especially if you were young, you could not avoid wrestling. And eventually, my best friend was he watched some of it, and he was like, it's actually pretty good. You should check it out. And I was like, come on. And he was like, no, come over. You've just flipping through channels. And the flagship show back then, well, still, Raw, was really operating under a principle that has come to be known as crash TV, where you just try to put the most visually or auditorially insane thing that you can on the screen at all times, because if somebody's flipping through the channels, you want to make them stop and go, what the hell is that? And it worked on my best friend Brian. He was channel flipping. Unfortunately, he doesn't remember what he saw. I asked him about it, but he saw something that was improbable and strange, and he went, this is interesting, watched it, got hooked, and then made me start watching. This is the spring of 1999. And I gradually became a very addictive watcher and ended up partying, watching Raw or pay-per-views or whatever with my bullies, my former bullies. We were now united by our love for wrestling. This is the first time I'd ever had more than one male friend ever. And it was a huge influence. I wrote an essay about this. You can get more detail about it, and Polygon, called Wrestling Turned Me Cis, Then It Turned Me Trans. And it's about this exact process where watching wrestling as a teenage, you know, male-bodied person, I saw it as a blueprint for like what society wanted me to act like. Not yes, the wrestling itself, but even more importantly, the guys who were watching it. I was supposed to act like them. And so watching it, we were all consuming the same thing, and I could sort of imitate them and feel more comfortable that way. And after a few years, though, of addictive watching, you know, again, millennials here, y'all know what I'm talking about. In 2001, the creative really took a dive. Because Vince bought WCW, his main competition, no longer had competition, and thus had no motivation to innovate anymore. And things really slowed down. Late 2001 or early 2002, I can't remember exactly when I stopped because it sort of petered out, but it was around late 2001, early 2002, I stopped watching. And I went 20 years almost without watching wrestling. But in 2020, my spouse and I were brainstorming ideas for my second book, and one of us, neither of us can remember who, said, what about a biography of Vince McMahon? And I remembered him vividly from watching wrestling as a child. And she had reported on wrestling as a local news reporter. So she didn't know him intimately, like his story intimately. And I didn't yet either, but I was like, yes, that's it. Because Vince is such a consequential figure. I knew enough to know that. And no one had really told that story. There was a book that came out like 20 years ago called Sex, Lies, and Headlocks that was a great starting point, but had a lot of things that were just factually inaccurate, didn't have any sources cited. You know, it had its problems. So there was an opportunity there to really try and tell that story. And also, Sex, Lies, and Headlocks was kind of kneecapped by the fact that Vince had not become... Vince's brand of wrestling and Vince's philosophy about life had not broken into the presidency yet. That was still a long way off as of 2004 or whenever it came out. And so once I was pitching it, though, I mean, all that stuff I just read to you, that all happened like the week after I had decided to write a proposal for the Vince McMahon book. Like, that's really a time capsule from that moment. What I read you was that ended up, a version of that was the beginning of the book proposal. And I thought I wasn't going to open the book that way, but it was just such a perfect little snapshot of where mentally a lot of us were as of, you know, whatever it was, March 17th. I can't remember the date all of a sudden, but April, whatever, in 2020. But, you know, I wrote the proposal, and then I was lucky enough that the second editor we sent it to had been trying to do a Vince McMahon biography for 5 years and hadn't found the right Cinderella for the slipper. So he liked my proposal, and here we are. That was a very long-winded answer, but that is... I now watch wrestling... I watch WWE wrestling pretty regularly. Now, like, I keep up with it. Because I know I'm going to write the sequel someday. If I don't die of consumption. And it's really interesting. I'm enjoying it a lot more now because there's much less pressure on me. I'm just doing this in long-term string gathering as opposed to, God, I have a deadline, I need to cram and watch as much wrestling as I possibly can and pay really close attention. I'm keeping tabs on it, and I enjoy it a lot more now that I'm done with the book. I feel more confident, and also it's less pressure. Keep talking, I'm just going to blow my nose. Does anyone else have a question? Yes, or either one of you. Rock, paper, scissors for it.
I was just going to ask if you think that any of the tendencies that Vince had with his parents, he passed on to, his
Shane and Stephanie. So Vince has 2 kids that we know about. Shane and Stephanie. What? Oh, microphone. Yeah, that'd be important. Thanks. Shane was always billed in the fiction of wrestling as the inheritor. Like, he was the young version of Vince. But what I found in my reporting was it's very much the other way around. Vince and Shane have never really gotten along, especially in Shane's adult life. Vince is sort of perpetually disappointed in him. I think he's kind of a numbnuts. That's what I've heard, at least. And Stephanie, on the other hand, boy, that apple did not fall far from the tree, is what they say. You know, I haven't met either of them in person, but from the interviews I've done, Stephanie is the one who really inherited her father's killer's instinct. Like, she has the cold eyes of an operator. And she has been a very successful executive, in no small part because she is ruthless when it comes to all that, and a creative as well. But even for her, it may have been that there was a bridge too far. Hopefully I'll be able to get the full story on this for the sequel. It all happened long after I was done with the book. But as you may have heard, Vince has been in the news recently because WWE got sold. They call it a merger, but it wasn't. This was like he was trying to sell the company. It's a complicated operation, but that's essentially what it was. Now, his boss, for the first time since his dad, he has a boss. And he didn't get along with his dad. But his boss is Ari Emanuel, as in the inspiration from Entourage and the brother of Rahm Emanuel. And he, during that process of coming back after having been ousted for sexual misconduct allegations last summer, he forces his way back in, and lo and behold, Stephanie, who had been the interim co-CEO while he'd been gone, abruptly resigns. She's gone. You know, spend more time with my family, etc., etc. Now, she's married to Triple H, to Paul Levesque, who is a former wrestler and now kind of the public face of WWE in a lot of ways. And he still is that. So if there's bad blood, it's managed. But this is a family that has been very hurtful to one another at times. You know? And I think, my hope is someday I'll get to interview at least one of the kids. I think we could have a really interesting conversation. I'd love to interview Shane. I think Stephanie, I don't know how useful it would end up being, because she's very good at media training and how to talk to the public. Shane is less polished in that regard, and I think that we could have an interesting conversation about his father. But, yeah, so he passed it on, I think, in some ways to Stephanie, although I don't know how close that makes them. You know, I think they were very close for a long time. I had a source who talked about how they used to kiss on the mouth in the office. Like, that was their greeting. So they have a very close relationship, or at least did. I don't know what the status of it is right now. And the thing is, I'm not alone in that. What's really interesting about the past few months is even veteran wrestling reporters who have like 40 years of sourcing, they're all giving contradictory stories about what Vince was planning to do. Because I don't think Vince is telling anybody what he plans to do. Vince got ousted last summer and forced his way back in, and I think in general doesn't trust anybody at that company. He's become paranoid and isolated, as they used to say about Trump every other week, and I don't think he's telling anybody what he wants to do. So, or maybe, knowing him, he might be feeding disinformation. He's very good at working the information flows. So, yeah, I'll be very interested to see what happens with him and his kids. We'll see. Anybody else? You had one.
Yeah,
Yes.
I can offer you two.
Ooh, two. All right.
Yeah, either about the kind of Jewish aspect tying in Jacob all this, or what I also think is a super interesting angle is kind of moving forward into the sequel, which if Stephanie ends up taking
Yeah.
it could be a 3-part, you know.
Yeah, I know. Well, that was the thing. Well, I'll let you ask a question, but when I say I want to do a sequel, I really want it to be, the sequel would be about all four of them. Because the book ends with all four of them entering, all four of them in the storyline. They've all become characters. They've all sort of like sold themselves into kayfabe, the tension between fantasy and reality that is wrestling. And I would want to write about all four of them, including Stephanie, Shane, and Linda. Linda's wife, who is arguably the savviest of all of them. But anyway, yes. Ask either one. I'm cool with either one.
I'll go with the Jewish one.
I can't blame you.
So my relationship to wrestling is that I have none of it until my friend actually introduced me to it.
Oh.
But I, at the same time, had just had my first interaction with ballet in like a meaningful way. And immediately I'm like, oh, these are
Yeah, it's the same thing.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And
It's storytelling through movement.
exactly. And one thing that I saw that was also shared is that ballet relies on archetypes and characters to communicate who's going on.
Yep.
And so too are constructed here, these other characters.
And like ballet dancers, wrestlers destroy their bodies in the name of something that they love probably too much.
Yeah. Ballet dancers think they have it bad because the toes are wrecked.
Yeah,
They
no.
don't know that
Which is
the
bad.
rest of it
Don't give it in the joints too, but the wrestlers, they're all dead at 50, Anyway, go on.
And it strikes me as Jacob also formed these 12 archetypes in the tribes.
That's very interesting.
But from
like
the perspective of a loving father coming from a loving father,
Yeah.
if you think of this as he's trying to, imagine what a patriarchy is based off of his, what he's coming from like that.
Yeah. That's very interesting.
And Vince McMahon, of course, built the same thing, but in the inverse.
In the inverse, right.
His
On
last
cruelty
thing
and
that he did was
exploitation.
emphasize what the ultimate evil is. Like define
Yeah.
should never be allowed by a father.
And yet, here we are.
Right, and then you have this charge that just got resolved. So it's
Yeah.
a complicated person.
Very complicated guy. What was the other question?
Other one is anytime I come to something like this, I consume media interviews with a person beforehand, and I saw.
Oh,
something
did
that
you?
said
Okay.
Earlier, is that Donald Trump's favorite sport is wrestling.
Oh, yeah. I mean, you can't call it a sport, but his favorite athletic event, let Joey say it. But for Donald Trump, I think it's a sport. I have no idea what Donald Trump knows about what's fake and what's real.
That's exactly
I tried to interview Trump. I made way more efforts to interview Trump than Vince. Because Vince, it was made clear to me, you're not going to talk to Vince. Like, in so many words, WWE's publicist was like, don't hold your breath. Whereas Trump likes to talk. And this was late in the Trump presidency when, I know a lot of reporters who have interviewed Trump a million times. So I just kept asking them, like, how do I get an interview with Trump? And they kept kicking me to whoever was handling Trump's interview requests at a given time. But this is late in his administration. So the trouble was, nobody stuck around more than like a couple of weeks. Like, you could not pin down an interview because there was no stable person managing all this. I'm serious. You would just have to get a new email address every couple of weeks because like the press spokesperson had been fired or whoever was doing it. So I really want to interview him though. Trump actually, I think of everyone, Vince is most likely to lie to me. And Trump is the most likely to accidentally tell me the truth. That's the thing about Trump. I'm not praising him. You don't have to hand it to him in any way. But he does sometimes accidentally blurt out stuff that you're completely not supposed to say. And I don't know. I'd be very curious if I gave some momentum to Trump and said, what do you think about Vince McMahon? He loves Vince. Look at his tweets. If you go through the tweet archive and you search, there's the Trump tweet archive. There's the site that has them all there. You can search for Vince or McMahon or WWE. Nothing but praise. Everyone else in his life, he has loved and then hated and then loved and then hated. Whatever. Vince McMahon, he's known since 1981 when he and Linda and Vince were at a Rolling Stones concert in New Jersey and met backstage. Trump looks up to Vince. Like, Trump, seriously, when you look at the way he writes about and talks about Vince, it's such an honor to work with Vince. He quotes Vince as like this great genius for saying that the greatest thrill in life is entertaining an audience. All this stuff. And then he incorporates Trump into the wrestling. In 2007, before that, he had hosted 2 WrestleManias and then he participates, all that stuff. But yeah, Trump, I want to know what Trump thinks wrestling is. Because I know he's been watching since he was a kid. There's an interview in there where there's quotes in there rather from a childhood friend of Donnie Trump, who growing up in Queens would watch pro wrestling with Donnie. And it was McMahon family pro wrestling. They controlled wrestling in New York. So Trump has been watching McMahon family wrestling since he was like 5. It's crazy. He has watched so much wrestling. When I talk to wrestlers who have interacted with him, you know, when they talk about him coming back to the locker room, and like I was talking to somebody who was talking about him coming back to the locker room in 2007 when he was doing WrestleMania, and he just walked up to the guys and he was like awed by them. And he was like, "You all are doing such a great job. You're out there sacrificing your body." Like Trump is never obsequious unless it's somebody who really has gotten into his brain. And usually when he's obsequious, it's a double-edged sword and he turns on you. Vince, he has never turned on. That means something. And I want to know more about that. The second book, I hope, will be, you know, the criticism that I've gotten for this book that I is totally valid. It was not my fault. It was the word count. Is I claim that there's this big causal factor of wrestling and Vince's brand of wrestling leading to Trumpism. And I think I do make that case in the book. But there is a fair amount of it that's sort of fast-forwarded through because I ended 1999. He hadn't started, you know, Trump was not doing WrestleMania wrestling appearances yet. He was not, you know, clotheslining anybody yet. So that case is pretty ironclad. I just, in the next book, have to, like, go beat by beat. Because a number of people, to my shock, I was hoping that the Trump factor would not dominate. But that's what people want to talk about, you know. It could have gone either way. I almost, like, minimized the Trump stuff because I was like, people are sick of Trump. But then all of a sudden they're not sick of Trump. Now they want more Trump. Now they're sick of Trump. You know, it's very, the public's very fickle. But I happened to have put this book out during a period in the cycle when a lot of people wanted to ask me about Trump. And so I think people were expecting this book to be largely about that. And it's not. But the next one I think will be. So we'll see. What else? Or are we done?
I guess.
Yeah.
I, having read a good chunk of the book, I want to bring up the part where what I call the most North Carolina part of this book.
Oh, go on. I'm actually very curious. What is the most North Carolina
The most
part of
North
it?
Carolina part of this book, and I'd like to hear more about this, is when you go to, what is it, Havelock?
Havelock, yeah.
And you meet with his old
Which?
friends for breakfast at
Oh,
Bojangles.
I went to a Bojangles with a bunch of classmates and slightly older peers of Vince. Yeah, I'll tell you that story. That was great. When I started reporting the book, I was like, okay, well, I have to find people from his hometowns. And I joined a Facebook group for, like, Havelock High School alumni. It was like an open, anybody could join. So I just put it out and ask on the Facebook group where I'm like, hey, I'm writing this book about somebody who graduated in the class of such and such. Or no, he didn't graduate. He would have been attending for the first 2 years, such and such years. Anybody know him? And I got a younger woman saying, I was too young to know him, but if you really want the inside scoop, come to Havelock and on a weekday, go to Bojangles at 10 a.m. And I was like, okay. And she's like, seriously, just go there. The old timers all go there. They don't have anything else to do. So I eventually got vaccinated and came to North Carolina, and during the portion when I was in Havelock, I just showed up at the Bojangles at 10 a.m. and by about 10:15, there was like a decent table full of old timers, just septuagenarian guys who were only too happy to talk shit about Vince. Like I asked them, like, was Vince a fighter? Because he always said that he used to get into big fights when he was at Havelock High School, and then he was like almost kicked out. And they basically like cracked up, and they were like, no, of course not. Like he was a wannabe. They said there was one fight he got into, and he broke his hand, like throwing a punch, and had to wear a cast for the rest of the month or whatever. And that was about it, you know. But they were crucial. I learned a lot from them. Yeah, what were you gonna say?
I was just saying is that I think I told you this before that all you needed was like the Bojangles having like a college basketball game on in the background, and it would have just been the flag of North Carolina.
I'm honored. Thank you. It was good food. I like Bojangles. I don't have any appetite right now because it was cold. But if I did, I'd go get some hot sauce and try and clear my sinuses out. Okay, speaking of that, I think I'm going to call it right there. Is that okay? I just don't want to cough my lungs out on top of anybody. If anybody still wants their book signed, I think I've signed for everybody who's sitting here at this point. Great. Okay. Well, thank you so much. I really appreciate you coming out. This is super fun. And if for some reason you're going to be in Greensboro for the Literary Festival this weekend, I'm doing another event there if you want to come.